A grieving Perth father whose 4 young children were murdered during a custody battle is calling for a royal commission into the family court system. Arndt has also started a new foundation to help other families through bitter separations.
It was a sickening crime that left 7 people dead, shattering the Margaret River community and shocking the entire nation. 61-year-old Peter Miles shot dead his daughter Katrina, her 4 children and his wife Cinda before taking his own life in May last year. It ended a long and bitter custody battle over the kids between Katrina and her estranged husband Aaron Cockman.
I believe this could have easily been avoided.
Now he's turning his grief and anger into action. Mr Cockman blames the family court system and today headed to Canberra urging the PM to act.
Well, I'd like to call on the Prime Minister to support a royal commission into the family court system so it protects children.
He's also created the Arndt for Kids Foundation to help others cope with family breakdowns, with a particular focus on keeping children safe and healthy, a move backed by children's advocacy group For Kids' Sake.
Every fortnight in Australia, every 14 days, a child is killed by a parent or family member.
More than 1 million children in Australia are living without one of their parents. At least a quarter stop seeing one parent, and many end up in places like this, in the middle of long, costly and hostile custody battles. Mr Cockman says part of the answer lies in more mediation and education, with his foundation to help develop more child-focused policies, hoping to spare other families the consuming grief he now lives with. Natalie Forrest for 10 News First.
Hello everybody. I showed you that really sad little television clip to introduce a topic which is very dear to my heart, of reform of family law. It's something I've been working on, I worked on for decades and got involved in government committees trying to work out what to do about this problem. And I'm really pleased today I finally managed to get time with David Curl. Hello, David.
Hi, Bettina.
You'll have seen David in that television clip we showed. David is the founder of this, what I think is a really important organisation called For Kids' Sake. And I thought that was actually quite a powerful little segment they used from you in that television, talking about the damage to children of our current divorce system, and particularly even children being murdered.
Absolutely, and that's where we're coming at it from a different angle. We all know we've had a family law system in Australia for 40 years or more, and most people know that it's got really big problems, but they haven't managed to fix them. And one of the reasons is that we haven't really focused on what matters most of all, which is the welfare of children. Yep. Although we've got this phrase, the best interests of children, it's absolutely meaningless. There's a great quote from somebody who became the wife of a president, Hillary Rodham Clinton. She used to be a family lawyer, and she describes best interests as an empty vessel into which people pour their prejudices. It's meaningless,
absolutely
meaningless term. So what we're really focused on is the welfare, and what you find is that cases like Aaron Cockman, whose kids were killed in Margaret River last year, tragically, along with other family members, we're finding that that's often related to family court proceedings. We're finding that there's a correlation between ongoing or previous family law cases and these remarkable, horrific, extraordinary acts. But that's just the peak, the peak of an iceberg of harm done to children.
Absolutely. I mean, of course, I focused on men committing suicide, which is very much related to family law matters in an enormous percentage of cases, I think. Fatherless children, a whole range of issues come in here, but I think strategically it's a very clever idea to focus on the kids. So that's probably the only way we're going to get any traction over this issue.
It does matter strategically. Our focus is, and the members of For Kids' Sake are united in having seen the damage done to children. We all know children that were doing well at school, wonderful children, and then during the procedure of a court case, which often lasts, as you would know, not just for a day or two, but for years, these children are damaged beyond belief, and many of them never recover. They self-harm in their teenage years in large numbers, and those that make it through their teenage years, still are damaged. We have this saying, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. But it's not true.
No.
It really isn't. What damages you in your childhood damages you for the rest of your life, but beyond that actually creates intergenerational harm.
Yeah.
So we're finding that children who've been through this damaging system are not only harmed for life, they've got greater increased risk of mental health problems or physical health problems, but we're also finding that intergenerationally it causes problems later on.
Yeah. Now, that television clip we showed was about your visit to Canberra, and you were there lobbying parliamentarians. This is what you've been doing for years now. Tell me about that strategy. What are you trying to achieve there?
The family law system is determined by an Act of Parliament, the Family Law Act of 1975. That's what rules, the one ring to rule us all. That's what determines what happens in this space. The Family Law Act is written by legislators who are governed by what Parliament says and chooses to do. So if you want to change the system, you want to put pressure on the politicians who have control of that. And there's many ways you can put pressure on those politicians. We're using multiple ways, but one of the ways is to go to Canberra on a regular basis. We've been a number of times, as you say. We, for a relatively small non-profit organisation, we've met with close to half of all the federal MPs and senators so far, which is really quite unusual because most people who are lobbying on one small issue, they'll go and meet the minister or something like that. But we know that this is such a difficult issue to get across the line in a polarised, paralysed parliament that we actually have to appeal to every single person in that building and say, children are being harmed, this is the evidence, you cannot leave this parliament without doing something about it. And gradually we're making progress. It's a long, slow path. We're not expecting changes to happen within a year or two. I, at the beginning, said this is a 20-year task. And it really is a long, slow process, but we will get there.
I mean, you have some runs on the board. I know you were instrumental, certainly behind the scenes, working towards a Senate motion that was passed a few years ago, which sort of set up a new interest, if you like, from government, from Parliament in family law, which had been, they were desperately trying to avoid for an awfully long time, weren't they?
They were. 3 years ago, it just simply wasn't on the radar, and it absolutely wasn't on the agenda of government to do anything about this issue. At the time, the Labour Party, for instance, who always send out standard rote letters to everybody, all their letters actually said, in response to all these people writing in with all their graphic problems of children being harmed, men and women being harmed by this system, they would write back this standard letter that said, the family court is generally, the family law system is generally effective.
Oh, great.
That was 3 years ago. Now there's barely a week goes by that there isn't something about the family law system and about the damage to children, about the harm to men and women from this system. There's barely a week that goes by, and there's barely a month that goes by that there isn't somebody else calling for a royal commission into this system. So we have managed to help change that, and certainly our Senate motion was really quite strong. It said that the Senate called on the government to recognise that thousands of children are being harmed by our family law system. And it called for a root and branch review, as they call it, a thorough review. And that's pretty strong language, and it passed through the Senate, and that helped trigger the current review, which is inadequate, but it's part of a long process.
Deeply flawed review, which has 270-something references to family violence and no mention at all of the impact on kids, well, enforcing contact orders, for instance. But you're seeing that as part of a long process. I mean, it must have been rather frustrating when you saw how that was set up.
It is. We didn't actually have an input into the terms of reference for that, and they were very narrow. When we were involved with that original Senate motion, George Brandis actually walked across the Senate to try and persuade those that were putting the motion actually not to do it. And he said, we don't need a root and branch review. Well, he then came out and announced one a year or two later, but he unfortunately created very narrow terms of reference. And this is one of the biggest problems with this whole issue, is that unlike most other issues, whether it be climate change or drug issues, whatever it is, people have a view often Many people don't. But with this issue, not only does everybody have a view because everybody has a family, and most people have been affected one way or the other by it, but they have a view that I sometimes say is forged in the furnaces of their own childhood trauma in the case of many who had their own bad experiences, or influenced by their own relationship breakups. And unfortunately, nearly everybody sees this issue with blinkers on, so they see it from one side or the other, and it's very difficult to bring people together and create a holistic approach that really encompasses all the problems. But it is possible, and that's what we're doing.
I gather you're learning all about the private lives of all our members of Parliament. They end up telling you everything to do.
It's remarkable. I certainly know in general many who've been divorced, who've been through this process, many who are going through the process at the moment, and frankly that's hardly surprising given the lifestyle of politicians, especially from Western Australia, who spend half their life on a plane coming over here.
It's amazing they're not all divorced, that's right.
Well, I'm not sure whether this is one of our runs on the board, but it was 2 weeks after we'd met the member for Perth and talked about the importance of family and the dangers of not doing family breakdowns right, the harm to children. And we were talking all about this, and he was extremely interested, one of many people who've been very, very engaged with the issue. 2 weeks later, he resigned from Parliament for family reasons.
There you go. Maybe you achieved something. But of course, one of the problems, people have written to me recently about Pauline Hanson calling for a royal commission and it not getting through the Senate. Your point is you can't come from an extreme position. You have to win the majority with you, or you're never going to get any of this through. And that's why you're working very hard to get lots of women on board, get the people in the middle on board. Tell me more about that.
If you want to win a campaign like this is no small campaign. You absolutely have to have everybody on board. You cannot appeal to any extreme of the political spectrum. And the way to do it is to create consensus. As I said, people do tend to view it through their own lenses, from their own experiences. And the same happens in Parliament, where people are coming from one polarised end or the other. And the way you win this is firstly to focus on children and the harm to children, which nobody can criticise or argue against. Everybody must agree on that. Having done that, you then deal with everybody across the political spectrum, because we need friends in the middle, not simply friends on either end.
Well, you need women. I mean,
absolutely. This battle, ideally, will be won by, in our view, actually, women on the left of politics.
Absolutely.
Because that's where votes about social issues sort of tend to come and go.
Yeah. Well, I of course would argue that the reforms that were implemented under John Howard's government, which were about trying to introduce a concept of shared parenting, of children retaining contact, two parents in their life after divorce. I mean, all of that was undermined by women, and essentially, women coming in and playing the violence card, particularly women from the left. You're obviously not going to dare agree with me publicly on this, but we saw that. We saw all those reforms undermined by this push to use domestic violence as a means of giving women more power in family law battles. And I'm really interested in how you're going to change the minds of that group that has been so captured by ideology. How do you do that?
It's not so much whether I agree or disagree with what you're saying. The history is there to see. There were reforms that John Howard put in place, and incidentally he was told recently about the state of play in the family law system at the moment, and he was really disappointed apparently to hear that the reforms he tried to put forward hadn't had the ultimate outcome that was required. But I come back to this point of looking at it through either personal or political lenses. And if you can take a step back from that, then yes, John Howard introduced legislation that was focused on shared parenting and on men playing stronger roles in the lives of their children, as they should. And the further reforms during Julia Gillard's government in 2011, they focused on family violence. But if you take a step back, instead of thinking these as polar opposites... I
can't know how you can call that a reform, what Gillard did. They systematically undermined this assumption that both parents should be part of a children's life.
It was a reform.
They removed any penalties for people lying in family court. I mean, the Gillard legislation had nothing to do with reform.
The word reform can be used neutrally. I'm not putting any value judgment
okay.
on the word reform, but I take the point that you're making. My point is that you can actually take a step back from a polarised position, and I'm not arguing in favour of one piece of legislation or another, but the point is that one of the reasons that John Howard's legislation was not successful is that it was done on a partisan basis.
Yeah.
And unless you get everybody across Parliament to agree on this issue, that is what will happen. You will get a Conservative government doing one change, and yes, it is technically a piece of reform, and then you'll get a Labour Party doing another piece of legislation.
Winding it all back. I mean, I've been involved in so many issues where this has happened. I mean, boys' education, there was all these movement happening to do something about the way boys were struggling in schools, and then as soon as there was a change of government, it all was wound back. I mean, you're absolutely right about this. When I was thinking about this in relation to the, this campaign I've been running about end violence against everybody, and talking to the government about that, but very conscious if they actually introduce something to change the focus away from ending violence against women to a broader approach, the minute Labor comes in, they'll be delighted to wind that back. I mean, it's just so, I don't know how you, anyway, I think you're the perfect person, David, because you're very politic and careful with your language, as you need to be. But just tell me how you're doing with the women. I mean, are you finding you can change hearts and minds on this issue? We've
been absolutely not stunned, but very pleasantly surprised. I mean, politicians get a bad rap for good and bad reasons. But they're all human beings ultimately, men and women. And we have met, as I say, with over 40%, close to half of all of the federal MPs and senators so far. And almost without exception, we've had very strong acceptance of our core message, which is far bigger than family law reform.
Yep.
Our core message is that family breakdown, family separations do not belong in courts. This is a social issue. It's a child health issue, and in actual fact, it's a major public health crisis. Family separation, family breakdown is arguably the biggest, least recognised health risk to children that exists.
Yep.
We know of other health risks. I've lived in Aboriginal communities for many years, and we see the risks to children in Aboriginal communities and to adults as well, but particularly to children. What we're doing with our family law system is the same sort of risks that we tragically expect to see in Indigenous communities, we're seeing across the socioeconomic spectrum, across all races and cultures, because the family law system is so harmful to children that it's creating an environment where childhood trauma is caused to thousands of children every year. And then, as I say, there are all those follow-ons from that.
So how do we change this? What do we do?
We have written a policy paper. We've written several policy papers. We distribute them to politicians. What we need to do is two things. We have to get public opinion motivated to do something about this issue, but at the same time, we have to get the right policies on the table, because if you don't get those two together, you have, for instance, what happened when John Howard sent in the intervention, which is something that most people in Indigenous communities and in the areas that I've lived did not think was the right solution. But there was such an outcry about problems in Indigenous communities that the government felt it had to do something.
Yep.
So if you've got a public outcry but not the right policies, you don't get the right outcome. If you've got the politicians with the policies but no public outcry, they won't do anything, especially on an issue like this. So what we're doing is we're, on the one hand, seeing politicians presenting them with well-reasoned policies as to what they need to do, and on the other hand, creating films that with filmmakers and media personnel.
You're a former filmmaker, or a current filmmaker.
That's my background, essentially making films. Fortunately, I've been lucky enough with films to make films that reach audiences of over 100 million people internationally. Now, I can't do that with a social documentary like the films that we're working on now, but we can reach millions. But equally
and one
importantly,
of the things you're doing is filming kids, young adults, who've suffered as a result of family breakup, which I think is a very good way of getting that message across.
Absolutely. If you film so-called warring parents, and I don't buy into any of this rhetoric that journalists currently use. So often it's not really warring parents. It's actually one parent who has unreasonable wishes or demands, and that unreasonableness may come from vindictiveness, it may come from a mental health issue, it may come from a personality disorder, it may simply come from the stress of that situation. But it's this rhetoric of warring parents is not an accurate one in my view, and that's what we need to address.
Yeah. Okay, so you're calling for a Royal Commission, which interests me because I suppose I've watched so many commissions and investigations into family law, good or bad, but the results just, whatever they come up with in terms of recommendations, hardly anything ever happens. What would be the difference here?
I don't like Royal Commissions in many ways. They cost a huge amount of money. I believe the Banking Royal Commission cost 75 million. I hope they paid for it. And the timescale is often years. And sometimes the recommendations are not implemented. But with this of all issues, we have seen, as we've just talked about, that if you leave it to the parliamentarians, they will swing one way and then swing another and then they'll swing back, and you will not make long-term sustainable progress. We have also clear evidence of the number of reviews that there have been, and when there is a good one, like a 2003 bipartisan report, Every Picture Tells a Story is what it was called, when you have good recommendations like that, they're ignored, and the other reviews are very narrow, or like the current review by the Australian Law Reform Commission that's about to report back in March. It's an extraordinarily narrow review. It's focused on essentially tinkering with the legislation. It's not major change. And remarkably, in an unprecedented statement, last year, the Chief Justice of the Family Court of Australia, John Pascoe, he himself called for a Royal Commission into his own institution. And if that doesn't send a message loud and clear to politicians, I don't know what would.
Okay. And then what? So we have a Royal Commission which is about, as much as anything else about it, what it does do is educate the public. I mean, we saw that with the banks, we saw that with the child abuse in the institutions. It shows what's going wrong, which is, I think, is a good public airing in a sense. What do you do? What else do you want?
You're quite right. The Royal Commission has several purposes that are. It's almost, the family law system is almost tailor-made for a Royal Commission. What it does is it raises an issue to a national status that this warrants and hasn't had enough of. It enables a degree of catharsis within a community. If you look at the apologies that are in Parliament, there are 3 or 4 of them now, there is absolutely grounds for an apology in the family law space to the children and families that have been harmed. But it does provide an opportunity for thousands, tens of thousands of people to have their story heard and listened to. So there is that. But obviously what we're after is the right recommendations. Having said all of that, we're not happy to wait 2 or 3 years for that to happen. We've proposed not only that there be a Royal Commission, but that we actually now put in place the measures that are needed to expand sort of education in schools so that children can be essentially forearmed. They can build resilience in the face of, for instance, the tactics that are used when parents set up. Children often get involved, and we need children to be helped by with critical thinking skills, relationship building skills, in a non-gendered way, this is, of course.
That'd be a really good idea. Instead of being taught that all the boys are bad and all men are horrible.
It's absolutely not about that. This is about developing skills that help them manage conflict, which frankly many adults could do with as well.
Absolutely.
There is then a parental education program, and we're not talking about, there are some good programs like Mums and Dads Forever is run by Anglicare, but the way that happens is 2 years down the track when people are in a court, and after they've been in the court for 6 months, the judge says, oh, by the way, have you gone on this course? Well, we need parents to be doing those sort of courses that help them much, much earlier on. And there are 2 missing elements in the current system. One is that before the court system, we have to have arbitration. As one UK High Court judge said, it's a no-brainer. It's quicker, more cost-effective, and creates a more sustainable result that parents will buy into if they're participating in arbitration than in a family court system that's destroyed their family. So we need arbitration. We, before that, need better mediation, because at the moment, the way that mediation is being done, it's not being done well in many cases. It needs to have a component of coaching so that parents are prepared for the process and ready to mediate.
Your main thrust, of course, is to keep children away from the court, keep people away from the court.
Absolutely.
And there have been approaches in the past which have attempted to do that, such as the establishment of relationship centres, where people were supposed to go and mediate and do the sorts of things you've been talking about. It's interesting looking back into why that went so wrong. I would argue part of the problem was given to organisations like Relationship Australia, which had massive agendas where men were never made to feel comfortable, as we saw last year interviewed Rob Tiller, who was forced out of his job with Relationships Australia, and it highlighted the fact that this is an organisation which doesn't act in a biased way towards the best interests of the children or the best interests of both parents. But also we had the lawyers involved. I mean, the Relationships Australia, when you go along to a mediation and you're told, well, go and get advice for your lawyer. The minute the lawyers are involved, you're totally screwed.
Absolutely. The moment the lawyers get involved, you're on a pathway to risking damage to your children. Arndt Cockman's case illustrates that very, very clearly, that his relationship, he was potentially getting back with his partner. They were going to the movies together. They were going down to the beach together as a family after they'd separated. The problem was not the separation. The problem, in his own words, was when the lawyers got involved. And that's what we see in so many cases. Once you hit a lawyer, unless you're really lucky to get one who's absolutely insistent on what's called collaborative law and will not do anything that is adversarial or getting into the court system, you have a problem. But the problem with the issues of the relationship centres is that you cannot have something being a monopoly. You have to have something where, if the private sector is involved, that you've got to be able to see who's doing it well and who's doing it badly. And so what we're after is a range of private sector and government interventions that you will be able to see. They'll collect evidence on how well they're doing and how badly they're doing, and whether men or women approve of how they're doing, and whether the children are coming out well. That's one of the biggest problems with the family court system. It's quite staggering. We had some questions asked in Senate estimates a few years ago of the former CEO of the family court, and we asked him, well, how many children go through the family court each year? And he said, oh, I don't know, well, we're not quite sure. He said 200,000 adults go through the system, but we don't know how many children, and this is an organisation that's there to act in the best interests of these people whom it doesn't count. But worse than that, he was asked, well, what about the outcomes? Tell us a bit about the evidence of how the outcomes are. Oh, well, that would be a big research project. We don't collect data on that. We haven't a clue. We hope the results are more positive than negative. If this were a hospital doing interventions, doing procedures on children, doing heart surgery, which is not a bad metaphor for what the family court does, we would have closed that hospital down yesterday.
Yeah.
They do no research on their results unless there's a little study by the Australian Institute of Family Studies down the track. And that is a huge problem. We have to have an evidence-based approach to this. And if you have an evidence-based approach to it, you go beyond the gender warfare that we have today. Yeah. What you find is that, sorry, I'm not interested in that sort of ideological argument one way or the other. We have the evidence. Those children are doing well. Swedish research, for instance, very clearly shows that parents in intact families have certain measures of success for those children. In single-parent families, much reduced, much lower on every measure you can imagine. Parents that are successfully co-parenting are almost as good, not quite, but almost as good as intact families. So the evidence is really clear from many countries that the best results for children are that children maintain as strong a possible relationship and develop a stronger possible relationship with both their parents and as many family members and friends as possible.
But you've told me that in Sweden what they managed to do was create a culture where it was frowned upon to alienate the other parent. That is something that's not socially acceptable anymore.
Alienation is still a problem actually in Scandinavia, so it proves that they haven't got everything right, but what they have done is they have a much higher percentage of co-parenting there.
Yeah.
And the majority of people consider it odd if their friends, when they separate, don't allow their children to see the other parent. So you're quite right. We do need to have a change of culture in Anglo-Saxon societies.
Yeah.
We have a very sort of almost primitive view of gender differences, and whereas in Scandinavia, there is far more equality, and that does equate to far greater percentage of co-parenting with far better results for many children. It doesn't conquer that issue of alienation. They still have the problem of many children being turned against another parent.
Yeah.
One of the best ways that you actually conquer that, you can see from China. We've travelled the globe over the last year looking at world's best practices. And in China, not that there aren't other issues and problems there, what you see is the networks of families and communities that they have makes alienation, the turning of a child against another parent, in a really sinister way, one of the worst forms of child abuse out there, although it's not on many people's radar. It makes that far less likely because the family, the community, looks after the family and doesn't let that happen.
Well, I'm really pleased that you also put your focus not just on parents being involved in the children's lives, but grandparents, but significant people who those children have had looking after them.
Are you saying that as a grandparent?
Yeah, I'm saying that as absolutely a grandparent my gorgeous granddaughter is my son's child, and I'm very conscious of how easy it would be to lose contact with that wonderful person in my life if that marriage broke up. And luckily my daughter-in-law is wonderful, and I worked really hard to stay close to her, as you have to as a grandparent, because I'm sure everyone in my situation is conscious of that risk now. I know so many people in my generation who can't see their grandchildren. It's absolute tragedy.
Look, it's devastating. It's one of the worst forms of elder abuse. Elder abuse is normally considered children financially taking their parents for a ride. But I can tell you from anecdotal surveys, the worst thing for a grandparent or for an elder is to lose access to their children. That is the worst thing. I know many people who've died not seeing their children, and that's a tragedy. But by a simple change to the legislation, we can start addressing that. At the moment, it focuses on, it makes a sort of comment about both parents seeing a child. But if we reframe it from a child's perspective, that line in the legislation can talk about the importance of a child maintaining connections with all the people with whom they can maintain a significant and positive relationship. And if we have child-focused language, it's not just focused on the parents, but on the extended families.
Yeah.
And if you do that, even if there is an issue of some form of abuse from one parent or another, whether it be physical or psychological, you can potentially protect that child by allowing that child still to see extended family members, and that child can grow up in a much, much healthier environment.
Sure. All right, well, what do we do about the violence issue? I mean, when I think about family law, that's the thing that just makes me tear my hair out. The grip the violence card, as I call it, has on the whole family law system, the way apprehended violence orders are being used for strategic advantage, particularly by women, almost always by women. I mean, how do you do something about that?
Violence is violence, whether it's family violence or random violence. And if there is an accusation of violence, it needs to be heard urgently, and it should be heard in a court that's used to dealing with potentially criminal matters, and that in Australia happens to be local or magistrates' court. That's what happens in other countries. They separate family matters from matters of violence. If you deal with any issues of family violence in a court that's used to dealing with violence, using proper standards of evidence and a quick timescale, then you have a finding about that issue that feeds itself into the process of what happens in family separation. What happens in Belgium, just as an example, is that they have the court that looks after family violence or any form of violence, and if there is a finding there, that's fed into the family court process. But it's properly examined, it's judged as whether using proper standards of evidence, and a timescale that is rapid, because you need to deal with any issues of family violence very quickly. We need to, all forms of violence, physical and psychological, need to be stopped today before they get worse. If you've done that, and if you actually let family separation be kept out of courts and dealt with by arbitration or by earlier positive, healthier interventions, there's actually not very much left for the family court to do.
So there shouldn't be the overlap, and there shouldn't be the strategic advantage in using that sort of allegation.
At the moment, absolutely. You have a family court system that conflates all these issues.
Yeah.
So you've got family violence accusations without a proper early finding,
Yes.
just floating around.
No investigation whatsoever.
There's very little forensic examination, and that's critical whether there is violence or not. You need to know straight away. And at the moment, there are cases where there are apprehended violence orders in place, or hearings are scheduled, a year or so down the track. And you need to know whether a child is being harmed or not. Because one of the big problems with the system at the moment is that it recognises the risk of harm from physical or sexual violence, which is we absolutely want to stamp out immediately. We'd like a world where that didn't happen. What the court system doesn't recognise is that there is an equal and opposite risk of wrongful removal of children from loving parents. That does actually, and the evidence is clear, psychological harm is the key component of any form of abuse. Removing a child wrongly from a loving parent actually can have just as bad consequences as leaving them with a parent who is physically abusive. They are both bad, and to remove a child from a loving parent and from a loving half of a family at the same time as leaving them with a psychologically abusive parent is the worst of all worlds. And that's happening very regularly. So we want to stamp out all forms of abuse, physical, sexual, psychological. We want to stop that all, but the way to do it is not through the current system. Investigate family violence properly and stop it originating as it does in many cases during a court case. So the actual proceedings actually contribute to the occurrence of family violence in many cases.
Yeah, there's some research showing that children are more likely to witness violence between their parents after, during the separation, after divorce than before, and that says it all, isn't it? How much this system is contributing to that problem.
I think it's appalling that it's unconscionable that we have a system in place that we know to be causing harm, and that shows no evidence of doing good, and the government is spending a couple of $100 million on it every year. It is quite extraordinary that we're happy to countenance that. We have to have another system. We have proposed very clear steps for implementing that, and what we want to see is money invested in these earlier interventions, in education, in promoting healthy, I was going to say alternatives, but we want to get away from that word. These are the proper ways of dealing with family separation. They're not alternatives to the court. The court is an alternative to the proper way of doing it.
Absolutely. Well, you have all your information available. People can go onto your website. We'll put details of that. And also, hopefully, people will support this new organisation that is achieving so much in getting, I suppose, get a discussion around family law reform in the right direction. So you have a fundraiser, we'll put details up about that. David, very nice to talk to you today. I hope this will inspire lots of people to get behind you in what I think is a really important battle you are fighting.
Thanks very much for your time.
Thanks, David.